The Korean War, a conflict often overshadowed, a struggle frequently relegated to the footnotes of history, often called the Forgotten War, a label that speaks volumes about its place in the collective memory. It's a war that many have tried to erase from their minds. It was overshadowed by the monumental scale of World War II and the divisive turmoil of Vietnam, two conflicts that loom large in the American consciousness. Yet its impact still shapes our world, casting a long shadow over international relations and geopolitical strategies even today. The echoes of that war reverberate across the Korean peninsula. It began in June 1950 with a swift and unexpected invasion. It began on a peninsula few Americans could find on a map, a distant land seemingly insignificant to the global power balance. But it soon drew in nations from across the globe, transforming a local conflict into a major international crisis. The world watched with bated breath. The conflict was brutal, a relentless and unforgiving struggle for survival. Millions died, most of them civilians, caught in the crossfire of ideological warfare, and families were torn apart, their lives irrevocably shattered by a new, heavily fortified border that divided a nation. Generations were separated, never to see each other again. For soldiers, it was a harsh lesson in modern warfare, a brutal introduction to the realities of combat in the atomic age. Fought in extreme conditions against a determined enemy, they faced unimaginable hardships and endured unspeakable horrors. The Cold was as much an enemy as the opposing forces. Unlike other wars, it ended not with victory, with triumphant parades and celebrations. It ended instead with an uneasy armistice, a fragile truce that continues to this day. A ceasefire that has lasted over 70 years, a testament to the enduring tensions that still plague the Korean peninsula. Veterans returned home to little recognition, their sacrifices often overlooked and unappreciated, their sacrifices largely ignored as the world moved on, eager to forget the pain and trauma of war. Yet, to forget the Korean War is to ignore the roots of today's global tensions, to disregard the lessons learned at such a high cost. It was the first major conflict of the Cold War, a proxy battle between superpowers that shaped the geopolitical landscape for decades to come. It was the first test of the United Nations, a crucial moment that determined the organization's ability to maintain peace and security in a divided world. And it set precedents in military and diplomatic history, influencing the strategies and tactics of future conflicts. The story of the Korean War is not just history, it's a vital lesson for the present and the future. It's a warning about the cost of division and the courage of those who endured it, a reminder of the human toll of ideological conflict. The seeds of the Korean War, a conflict that would engulf a nation and draw in global powers, were sown long before the first shot echoed across the 38th parallel. The roots of this devastating conflict lie in the complex aftermath of World War II and the ideological battle lines that were being drawn across the globe. After 35 years of harsh Japanese rule, a period marked by oppression and exploitation, Koreans, with hearts full of hope and dreams of self-determination, yearned for complete independence in 1945. They envisioned a unified and sovereign nation, free from foreign control. But the peninsula, a land with a rich history and a unified culture, was tragically split at the 38th parallel, a decision made by the US and Soviet Union, the two dominant superpowers of the post-war world. This division was an arbitrary line that callously ignored the intricate tapestry of Korean geography, the deep-rooted connections of families, and the shared heritage of the Korean people. The Soviets, seeking to expand their sphere of influence, installed Kim Il-sung, a communist leader in the north, while the US, determined to contain the spread of communism, backed Syngman Rhee, an anti-communist politician, in the south. Both leaders, fueled by fervent nationalism and differing ideologies, were determined to unify Korea, but each envisioned a Korea unified under their own rule, their own political system, and their own vision for the future. This ideological clash and the unwavering ambition of both leaders only served to deepen the divide, solidifying the separation between North and South. The split severed railways, vital arteries of commerce and transportation, disrupted industries, crippling the economy and hindering progress, and tragically separated families, tearing apart communities and creating a humanitarian crisis. The 38th parallel, once a mere line on a map, was rapidly transforming into a permanent scar, a physical and emotional barrier that divided a nation against itself. As the two Koreas solidified their separate identities, tensions escalated. Border skirmishes became increasingly frequent and violent. Hostile rhetoric filled the airwaves, poisoning relations and fueling animosity, and mounting distrust eroded any hope of peaceful reconciliation. For 5 long years, the Korean peninsula simmered with unrest, a pressure cooker of political and ideological conflict. The 38th parallel, becoming a fuse, taut and ready to ignite the powder keg of Korean division. What began as a temporary measure, a pragmatic solution to disarm the Japanese forces, became a hardened border, a symbol of division, and a stark reminder of the Cold War's global reach. It was a border, one that would soon explode into a devastating war, a conflict that would claim millions of lives and leave an indelible mark on the Korean peninsula. The division was not just political, a matter of competing ideologies and power struggles. It was a profound national tragedy, a wound that cut deep into the heart of the Korean people. Ultimately, the Korean War was set in motion by decisions made far from Korean soil, decisions that would forever alter the course of Korean history and shape the geopolitical landscape of the 20th century. On June 25, 1950, North Korean forces launched a surprise invasion across the 38th parallel. Backed by Soviet tanks and planning, they quickly overwhelmed the unprepared South Korean army. Seoul fell in just 3 days. Chaos and panic swept the south. Millions of civilians fled, becoming refugees overnight, caught between advancing armies. The North's blitzkrieg pushed defenders into a small corner around Busan, the last stand for South Korea. The world watched as the peninsula teetered on the brink of total conquest. Kim Il-sung's gamble seemed poised for victory. The fate of South Korea and the region hung in the balance. The invasion marked the start of a brutal civilian devastating war. The question, would the world intervene, or would Korea be lost? The North Korean invasion jolted Washington and the United Nations into action. President Truman saw it as a test of American resolve in the Cold War. With the Soviets boycotting the UN, the US pushed through resolutions condemning the attack and calling for military support. For the first time, the UN authorized force to stop aggression, forming a multinational coalition. General Douglas MacArthur was appointed commander. The first US troops rushed in, outnumbered and underprepared. Their sacrifice bought time for reinforcements from 16 nations to arrive. Soldiers from around the world fought under the UN flag, making this a truly international effort. The Busan perimeter became a symbol of resistance and hope. The tide had not yet turned, but the defenders were no longer alone. The world had chosen to stand against aggression. The Korean War became a global conflict overnight. With the Busan perimeter holding a crucial defensive line against the North Korean advance, the United Nations forces and their South Korean allies managed to stabilize the situation after months of intense fighting and heavy casualties. The defense of this area was paramount to prevent the complete takeover of the Korean peninsula. General Douglas MacArthur, the supreme commander of the UN forces, conceived a bold and risky plan to break the stalemate, an amphibious assault far behind enemy lines at Incheon. This strategic move aimed to cut off North Korean supply lines and force them to retreat. Despite facing immense logistical challenges and skepticism from many military advisors, the landing at Incheon was a stunning success. The element of surprise, combined with the determination of the US Marines, overwhelmed the surprised North Korean defenders. Following the Incheon landing, UN forces swiftly advanced towards Seoul, engaging in fierce urban combat to recapture the South Korean capital. Seoul was recaptured, and the North Korean forces, now cut off and demoralized, began a general collapse. With the momentum now firmly on their side, UN troops surged north, pushing the retreating North Korean army back towards the border with China. The initial objective of defending South Korea had now transformed into a campaign aiming to unify the entire Korean peninsula under a non-communist government, a goal that seemed increasingly within reach. Pyongyang, the North Korean capital, fell to the advancing UN forces, and victory seemed near as the war appeared to be drawing to a swift conclusion. The leading elements of the UN forces, primarily American and South Korean troops, approached the Yalu River, which marked the border between North Korea and China. However, China had repeatedly warned through diplomatic channels that it would not tolerate foreign armies on its doorstep, viewing such a presence as a direct threat to its own security. General MacArthur, confident in his assessment of the situation, and perhaps eager for a complete victory, dismissed these warnings from China, a decision that would prove to be fatally flawed. In late 1950, as the weather turned bitterly cold, hundreds of thousands of Chinese People's Volunteer Army troops secretly poured across the Yalu River, undetected by UN intelligence. The massive influx of Chinese soldiers launched devastating surprise attacks against the overextended and unsuspecting UN forces, catching them completely off guard. The entire complexion of the war's momentum reversed almost overnight, as the Chinese intervention dramatically altered the balance of power on the Korean peninsula. The UN forces, facing overwhelming numbers and fierce resistance, were forced into a desperate and often chaotic retreat southward, abandoning much of the territory they had recently conquered. The conflict entered a new, far bloodier and more protracted phase, characterized by intense fighting and staggering casualties on both sides, with no clear end in sight. The initial dream of a quick and decisive victory, fueled by the success of the Incheon landing, vanished completely, replaced by the grim reality of a long and arduous war. The Korean War devolved into a grinding, unpredictable struggle, marked by brutal trench warfare reminiscent of World War I, with both sides locked in a bloody stalemate. The international community realized that this was no longer a localized conflict confined to the Korean peninsula, but a major proxy war between the United States and China, with global implications. The stakes of the Korean War, and the costs in terms of human lives and resources, had just escalated dramatically, transforming it into a far more dangerous and complex geopolitical crisis. The Chinese intervention shattered hopes for a swift end. Massive, human wave attacks overwhelmed UN lines, forcing a brutal retreat in freezing conditions. Seoul changed hands again. The war devolved into a bloody stalemate. Battles for hills like Porkchop and Heartbreak Ridge cost thousands of lives for little ground. President Truman shifted the goal, not unification, but defending South Korea's independence. MacArthur's push to expand the war led to his dismissal, reinforcing civilian control over the military. Peace talks began, but fighting dragged on for 2 more years. Soldiers endured a war of attrition, fighting for survival as diplomats argued. The front barely moved, but the human cost kept rising. For Koreans, the war was catastrophic. Cities destroyed, families shattered, millions dead or missing. Civilian suffering was immense. The peninsula became a battlefield, and the border a permanent wound. Relentless bombing left North and South Korea in ruins, with millions homeless and industries destroyed. Atrocities were committed by all sides, deepening mistrust and trauma that still lingers. The war's psychological scars shaped generations, fueling division and grief. International forces paid dearly. Over 36,000 Americans died, with heavy losses for other UN nations and China. Soldiers returned home to indifference, their sacrifices largely forgotten. The cost of drawing a line against aggression was staggering. The Korean War's legacy is measured in both lives lost and futures altered. The suffering of the Korean people remains one of history's great tragedies. The price of freedom was paid in blood and sorrow. The Korean War was a turning point, a bridge between old and new kinds of conflict. It was the first major Cold War clash, fought under the UN flag, setting a precedent for international intervention. Jet fighters and helicopters changed warfare, with MASH units and medevac flights saving countless lives. The US military fought as a racially integrated force for the first time, accelerating the civil rights movement. It was also the last war before television brought combat's reality into American homes. The war's ambiguous ending introduced a new uncertainty to the American experience of war. The lessons of Korea would echo in Vietnam and beyond. The conflict's innovations and ambiguities shaped the modern world. On July 27, 1953, an armistice ended the fighting, but not the war. The new border, the DMZ, remains the world's most fortified line. A peace treaty was never signed. South Korea rebuilt into a vibrant democracy. North Korea became isolated and repressive. The war cemented the Cold War divide and America's global military presence. China emerged as a major power, willing to challenge the US on the world stage. The Korean War's legacy is a world shaped by division, nuclear anxiety, and unresolved conflict. To remember Korea is to remember the cost of forgetting and the price of unfinished peace. The peninsula remains a flashpoint where history's wounds are still open. The armistice holds, but true peace remains elusive. The Korean War is not just a memory, it's a warning for our time.